Hey guys, George Mesa, Third Eye Edify podcast. And I have a very exciting guest for us today who has a book, two books as a matter of fact, about a topic that seems to be more important than ever. And as usual, it's always been there. It's just a matter of what dark corners you uncover information from to find out certain things. But her bravery, in my opinion, is a really big deal, having come from the field that she's discussing now. And I can't wait to get into the topics that she's introduced in her book. And it's funny how you look back on your life, me being a little over 40 at this point, and remembering all the stuff that I used to watch. The TV was a really big deal in the 80s and 90s, obviously. And particularly near the maybe midpoint of the 90s into the 2000s, we had a ton of medical shows, Grey's Anatomy, ER, House. These were all really, really popular shows. And even before then, just the term brain dead would come up. Oh, what are you, brain dead? And it seems to be this thing that it was always there, but it wasn't questioned the way that it's being questioned now, thankfully, because of people like my guest here. And even the term coma to me, it seemed like the most terrifying thing. It was always in movies. It was always, I remember like an episode of Tales from the Crypt. If anyone remembers that show, there was this episode where there was this first person perspective of someone on an operating table, and he was cognizant. He was speaking to himself, but no one could hear him. He couldn't move. And they did some operations on him. And that was the horror point of the episode. It stuck with me. These things have always been on my mind. And since my wife is becoming a midwife, as a lot of my audience knows, she's dealing with the opposite end of things, the entrance into the world, the portal into the world. And now we're going to thankfully have a chance to discuss the other side of that. So before I go on too far, Dr. Heidi Klessig, thank you so much for giving me your time to be here today. I think that my audience is going to very much appreciate what you have to offer here. I've had a chance to read almost all of your book. I only got it a few days ago. I would have finished if I wasn't stopping every single page to make notes and look at things. This is an unbelievable topic, and it seems more timely than ever to discuss it. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, George, I really appreciate you having me on the podcast. And I appreciate that you have the longer format so that we can really get into this topic. Because again, as you said, this is something that we've all sort of grown up with. We've sort of accepted it unquestioningly. But, when I did my own research, there have been for 50 years, doctors, philosophers, lawyers, scholars fiercely debating whether brain death is death, but the public is never informed. And that's where I see my role is to give the people who are being asked to donate their organs a seat at the table.
Wonderful. And the name of the website from your book, respectforhumanlife.com, is this your website, or is this the website that you're a part of?
This is my website, respectforhumanlife.com. If you want to, just to get a quick overview, there's everything you might want to know in very succinct language, but we have the links to all the original source documents so you can research it for yourself.
Something the mainstream news will never do. I will definitely throw that in there, because what you're doing is far more important than a lot of that. And this is why I can have a long format. I'm sitting in my bedroom right now, and I'm willing to discuss this at length because it is so important. And I like that you said succinct language, because reading your book, it's important to quickly note. And I've had a few other authors on the show who I've had the pleasure to introduce this very simple concept to, is the idea of simplicity. You're not writing this to a very exclusive audience of PhDs. You are writing this to anyone who wants to read this, can open the book, and maybe there's one or two terms that they might have to look up because it's some, doctor term, but even EEG and things like that, you spell them out. You make sure that everyone understands what you're saying, and you're coming from a human point of view more than anything else. As the name of your website implies, respect for human life. You are respecting the reader by not making it impossible for them to approach it. And that is a really big deal, because even as a musician, I find that other musicians, sometimes they'll talk our language to other people, and then they don't know what's going on. And that's not how you engage with people. That's not how people lose interest in your professional topic if you don't include them by making it in a simplified version. And your book does a very good job of doing that.
Well, thank you. That was my goal. I wanted it to be fully referenced so that if you were a doctor or a nurse, you could really get into the original source documents, but I wanted it to be for everyone. And what really made my day, I have a 95-year-old little old lady friend, and she read it. And so the fact that she could read my book made me feel really good, like I'd accomplished my purpose.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good point. And when I wrote my book, I went for a slightly larger font, and I think you did as well. And that's perhaps one of the reasons she was able to get through it.
Right.
Because even the average playing card is not the right font for a lot of people. So it's good. You nailed it. And her most recent book, The Brain Death Fallacy, is what we're discussing here. And that is the exact topic. Why don't we start here? Before I read a quote from the book that I think is more than important. How often do lies become laws? Because it seems to happen pretty often.
Well, I think all of us know that right and wrong is a completely different concept than legal or illegal. And all through human history, there have been many things that have been legal that we can think of that were wrong. And this is, again, what has happened with brain death. It is legal. It is legal, but it is not morally right. And in a way, it's not even legal, strictly speaking, because the way doctors diagnose brain death today does not comply with the law in the United States, which I can kind of describe for you as we get along further in the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, and one of the more surprising, I try not to be surprised by much anymore, but one of the most surprising things, and I think I don't want to quote it wrong, but I found out very quickly in one of the middle chapters that states have different death requirements by law, and that organ donors have more lenient laws placed on them, less of a human approach, in other words.
Yeah.
Can you maybe give a little more information about that?
Sure. Well, I think, a good way to begin, maybe to introduce the topic, would be to let your viewers and listeners encounter it the way I first did. So let me tell you my personal experience, if I may.
Sure.
In my first year of my anesthesiology residency program, when I was in training to become an anesthesiologist, I came in, sort of out of the blue one night for night call and reported for duty. And they said, Klessig, glad you're here. We want you to go up to ICU. We have a brain dead organ donor that we want you to bring down for an organ harvesting. And, it kind of blindsided me because I thought, wow, I sort of looked back in my mind. I vaguely remembered hearing a lecture about brain death somewhere along the line, but I did not have all the details right at my fingertips. So I asked the OR coordinator, I said, brain death, huh? Is there anything different about this I need to know? And he laughed and kind of rolled his eyes, and he said, how eager the transplant team can be. Just be sure someone has actually declared him brain dead.
Right.
Well, that wasn't reassuring at all. But, so up I went to the ICU, and I found my patient. He was a young man. He was about my own age at the time. He had been in a motorcycle accident and had sustained a very severe head injury. And yes, the neurologist had declared him brain dead. So I went to see my patient, and, honestly, the first thought that went through my mind was how glad I was that his family wasn't in the room with him. Because if you've ever had surgery, you know that when the anesthesiologist comes to talk to you, we try to reassure you and your family that you're going to be well taken care of, you're going to be kept comfortable, and we're going to do everything we can to return you back to your room in a good, comfortable state. But, what would I have said to a family whose loved one wasn't coming back? So I was glad it was just the patient and I in the room. And then I went to look at him, and, he sure didn't look dead. I mean, he looked just like every other person from the ICU I had taken to the operating room and anesthetized. In fact, he looked better than a lot of them. He had normal vital signs. He had stable blood pressure and heart rate. He had excellent oxygen saturation in his blood. His skin was warm and supple. He looked like all the other patients in the ICU who were getting better, right? So I went down to the operating room again, and I found the anesthesiologist who was going to be supervising me for the case, and I presented the facts to him. And so he said, well, what is your anesthetic plan of care? So I said, well, I think I'm going to give him a paralyzing agent so he doesn't move during the surgery, because, surgeons get real crabby when people are moving and they're trying to operate. And I think I'll give him fentanyl, which is a potent painkiller, which should blunt any heart rate or blood pressure swings that might damage the organs. So then he said, well, are you going to give a drug to block consciousness? And I was stunned. I asked, why would I do that? Isn't he dead? And I'll never forget the long look he gave me. He just gazed at me over his operating room mask, and he said, why don't you give a consciousness blocker just in case? And he walked away.
Wow.
Well, my mind was swirling at this point, but, I'll tell you, to my regret, I didn't stop the process, even though it seemed very confusing to me. I was under this time pressure. The surgery team was waiting. I was being told what to do. And sadly, instead of thinking for myself, I did what I was told. I took the young man to the operating room and I gave him our planned anesthetic. And I'll tell you that this young man responded to the surgery, to the incisions, to the bone saws, to the pulling, the tugging, just like anyone else. And he required the same types and the same amounts of anesthesia. And so, looking back on it, I'm quite clear I participated in the medical murder of a vulnerable patient. And it is my regret over this that motivates me to be researching and speaking about this today. I mean, think about it. I told this story to a pathologist friend. And she told me, when she does an autopsy in the morgue and removes organs, she doesn't have to give any of these drugs.
Oh, right.
So what I'm here to tell you is these patients are in no way dead.
Right. And they're denied rights regardless.
Well, and the fact that they have been redefined as dead does remove the human rights we give to any other living person. So it's a redefinition of death. And so this whole discussion and this experience of mine led me to ask myself, well, what is death? When is someone dead? And there's an idea that, I hear people say, my Uncle Charlie, he died 5 times and the doctors kept shocking him back to life, right? Which is a common way that people speak, but it's not actually correct. I mean, if you can be resuscitated, you were never dead. I mean, there was life in your body and the doctors could help you, maintain that life. But once, the life principle leaves our material body, no one comes back from the dead. The word for coming back from the dead is not resuscitation, it's resurrection. And
Right.
That doesn't happen without divine intervention. Right.
Very good point.
Right. So again, most people, I meet very few pure materialists, people that think we're just meat in motion. I mean, most people define death as the separation of the spirit or soul or life principle from the body, right? But our spiritual part is immaterial, and we don't have any device to detect the exact moment when that immaterial part of us departs from the material body. So historically, death has been declared, not by a doctor. I mean, we've usually had death declared, at home, on the farm, on the battlefield, when people could see that there was the complete cessation of all vital functions beyond any possibility of return. And usually the index symptoms for this were the absence of heartbeat and breathing over time. And that's definitely where we get those traditions that we have. I mean, the traditions of the vigil, the traditions of, the women of the family washing and anointing the body, the tradition of the wake. I mean, everyone, were around the dead person, and it was a helpful tradition. I mean, these things allowed time to let the reality of the departure of a loved one sink in, and allowed time for grieving. But that has really changed. Now, death is declared almost as quickly as possible because of the pursuit of viable organs.
So the pursuit of money, perhaps, is another side factor of this.
It's interesting. I think that money is a part of it. There's also a sort of an unholy zeal on some people's minds about that they're doing such a good and noble act to procure organs for others in need. So it's hard to tease out where one motivation, the money motivation, begins, and this zealous motivation to try to do good begins. So I think it's a combination.
Very good point. And I also think that it's not necessarily always a motivation more than a removing of the concept of spirit, like you had mentioned. And personally, I was calling myself an atheist when I was a teenager, and times have changed. But I think that the push for this idea of atheism was a very big part in helping people make a decision like this, because it's like, well, whatever. I mean, it's just a body now. And even the Pope Pius XII, which you mentioned several times in the book, who was a part of getting people to think a certain way about all of this. He, in so many words, said that, if you're dead, it's done. All of your stuff is mine now. I can remove what I want from you and just give it to somebody else. And that doesn't seem very attached to spirit. It really doesn't, to me.
Yeah. And so to kind of tell you where this change happened, I mean, the landmark date that we can put on our calendar is 1968. So in 1968, 13 men at Harvard Medical School came out with a landmark article in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it's called A Definition of Irreversible Coma. And basically, they thought that we could simply, by the stroke of a pen, we could redefine certain people in a coma who, up until that point, had always been considered to be alive, as now being somehow dead. And these men wrote this paper without any scientific references whatsoever. There were no tests, there was no study, there was no evidence that these people in a coma were now somehow dead. The only reference, as you mentioned, was a reference to a speech given by Pope Pius XII to a group of anesthesiologists. And in fact, I think the Harvard committee misquoted the Pope. The Pope was being asked by the anesthesiologists, when we have people who, that seems like they're in a case of no return, is it morally justified for us to remove life support? And interestingly, the Pope said a sort of a wise thing. He said, if the family feels that this is more than they can handle, the family may request that you do this, and you as doctors would be morally justified in removing care in what could be considered a hopeless or futile case. The Pope actually never said that doctors could do this unilaterally, which has become the case today.
And that's what happened. Right.
And that's what happened. And again, the justification, the people who were on the committee had a utilitarian philosophy, an atheistic philosophy, as you said earlier. They were not thinking about our spiritual nature. They said that the reason that we should redefine certain comatose people as being dead already is utility. They said it would have the laudable goals of freeing up ICU beds, which is a good thing for hospitals, and it would remove the controversy about removing these people's organs for organ transplantation. And that, again, benefits hospitals. It's not so much thinking about the patient, but it's thinking about what benefits the healthcare facility. So again, freeing up intensive care unit beds and facilitating organ transplantation was the reasoning that they had. But this utility underlying this, the redefinition was certainly of great utility because it allowed organ procurement to skirt the dead donor rule by simply, again, by fiat, by the stroke of a pen, declaring comatose people to be dead. Now, the dead donor rule is not a law, but it's a universal worldwide ethical maxim, and it says that people must neither be alive when their organs are removed, and they may not be killed by the process of organ removal. So if you simply, by sleight of hand, call these people dead already, now the dead donor rule no longer applies and you can move forward.
I see. So there's a certain level of convenience kind of packed into all this too. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. This was a way of moving ahead with the agenda of the transplant industry and making it sort of morally justifiable by redefining people as being dead who were not.
Right. Yeah, the transplant industry. I think maybe that we can save for part 2, because I'm very curious what else you have to say about it. It seems like you've been really in the trenches for quite a while here, and utility. Because we're kind of like in a philosophical conversation there. You also mentioned maxim, which is deontology, has the maxim of your actions, and very, again, philosophy. Utility, at a very simple level, if you kill one person and it benefits everyone else, it's great. That's a good thing, So keep that in mind as you hear terms like that. They're used very often, especially in political sense. It leads to wars. Hey, we have to kill them. Everyone else wins if they die, and this is like kind of finds a way in this that Harvard, the Harvard criteria, so to speak, that was created by it. It's a very short read. It's a surprisingly short read for such an important topic. And right away, it immediately says it's the mission statement, so to speak, of this paper, if you even want to call it that. It's not very thorough. Purpose is to define irreversible coma as death. That was the purpose of the paper. So it does seem like there was an agenda. That word that you used makes perfect sense here. Right? You can sense the agenda here. Something else that was said pretty early on, I'm paraphrasing from the foreword of your book, is that removing organs kills and the diagnosis of brain death permits the murder. And I see exactly what you mean. It kind of encompasses the ethos of where I'm coming from, experiencing this book firsthand. And thank you for telling us your story about what happened to you, because it was something that happened to you. A lot of people can finally start relating to what you were kind of forced into there through COVID. Really, I mean, people had to do things they didn't want to just to keep their jobs. And I think now the perspective can come full circle for you. The difference is there was a human life involved, whereas for me, managing a music store and teaching 40, 50 kids a week, I wore the mask, and it was the last thing on my mind to do. I had to get out of there eventually, but I did stay while the time was needed. And, everyone did something they didn't want to do just to keep a job. And it was very, very tough. And what you went through, I can't imagine, is not something that you get over, but you're really turning it around now. It's incredible.
People say, that I'm so brave for speaking. Honestly, I think for me it would be harder not to speak up, knowing what I know. It's just a ball of fire burning in my chest, and I agree. What you're saying about COVID, is sort of a mimic or an imitation or an echo of what happened in 1968. That this idea came barreling down, and if you wanted to keep your job, you as a doctor, you had to go along with it. And interestingly, you brought up the philosophical point too. Think about it this way: if we are a body spirit unity, right? And people who are of faith would say that this is a God-given spirit. If that's who we are, our life and death are in the hands of God. But if we redefine the human person to be thinking that we are our brains. Now the brain is a physical organ, and now we're putting who we are in our life and death in the hands of man. I mean, doctors can and do manipulate organs. And if all we are is our brains, well, that takes us out of the purview of the spiritual to the purview of the material. And it would be perfectly reasonable that doctors would manipulate our life and death if all we are is our brain. So that spiritual part is very important philosophically.
I couldn't agree more. And it seems that, there's this, and again, because of all the programming that we experience, there's this cultural want for a simpler, more, one-way street on any topic that regarding especially something like this. And there isn't one, but this helps provide that. It's convenience, just convenience and simplicity, where if there's a decision to make, let's say from the family, the doctor can say, look, if we do this, it'll be easier for them. Convenience again, even though it's not the right thing to do, it might be the easier thing to do. And that is never usually the way, in my opinion. There's this, it seems like there's, like you said, the brain's the one part of this. There seems to be the trifecta: the neurological, the cardiovascular, the pulmonary. The soul's kind of left out of this. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure if the spine falls into this. Is the endocrine system involved in any way? If I were to mention like the chakras, let's say, of life, does it fall into place, or they really just look at the trifecta and they choose one of those, failing, and that's it?
Yeah. So back in 1981, part of the reason that the idea of brain death was codified into law was that at the time, the brain was considered what they called the master integrator of the body. And so when a president's commission was seated to study, brain death in 1981, they were told, the testimony they received was that the brain was the master integrator of the body, without which all the other systems would very quickly stop working. Now, listen to that sentence for a minute. The brain is the master integrator, without which the biological death of the person would very quickly occur. Now, this is an argument based on a prognosis of death, right? Not a diagnosis. So right from the beginning, this idea of brain death was a prognosis of death, because they thought without the brain, the rest of the systems would break down. Turns out that is incorrect. Later medical study showed that the brain is really not that necessary for the body to continue to live. In 1998, Dr. Alan Schumann published a case series of 175 people who lived, one for ultimately more than 20 years after their declaration of brain death, right, under the laws of the time. And again, this shows that brain death is a prognosis of death. Now, I'm not saying that most of these people aren't very neurologically ill. They are, but we have no evidence that their spirits have departed. I mean, this young man who lived for more than 20 years, his name is TK in the literature, his initials. He was a little boy who, when he was 4 years old, contracted meningitis, and unfortunately, his brain was very completely destroyed by the infection. But his mother said, I want care for my little boy, and he became very stable over time, so much so that she was able to take him home, and she cared for him in her own home with a feeding tube and a ventilator. He grew. He went through puberty like any boy. When he died of an infection, some 20 years later, they actually did an autopsy, and there was absolutely no material left in his head. There was a bunch of disorganized tissues. There was a hard rock-like structure of scar tissue that they actually needed a saw to open up. I mean, he had no brain at all, yet right. He was digesting food, he was passing out waste, he had everything else. So there's no way of saying this man was dead. I mean, his spirit was obviously motivating and controlling and continuing life in his body. And, I was speaking at a bioethics conference just the other week, and a doctor who declares brain death, he was a critical care physician, asked me, well, how do you know? Maybe the spirits of brain dead people have departed. Mm-hmm. And I said, I have to agree with you. We have no way of knowing. We have no device to tell when the spirit departs. But from my point of view, I think the onus of proving whether the spirit remains or not is on you. I think you have to tell me and the rest of the world that for sure that person's immaterial part has departed before you cut them up for scrap. Why are we proceeding without that knowledge? But we are.
I love where you're coming from with this, and it's unfortunate that you had to live through what you've lived through to get to this point. But this is where you're a hero, in my opinion. This is how heroes are born, and you're really bringing to light something that, whether you're the first or not, you're really on the front lines of this.
Well, I'll tell you, could not do what I do without the many physicians and lawyers and philosophers who have been writing in the academic literature for nearly 50 years. I mean, I'm just telling the public what these really brave doctors who have put their careers on the line have been saying for years. People like Dr. Paul Byrne, Dr. Alan Schumann, Dr. Doyen Nguyen. I mean, these people have been writing the facts in the academic journals, but the public is never informed. And that's what really bothers me. People are never given any type of informed consent. They're told, in fact, what they're given is essentially slogans and propaganda. They're told, be a good citizen, give the gift of life. But, when you go down to the Department of Motor Vehicles, did you get a consent form about what it means to be an organ donor? No, of course you didn't. And so people, when they sign these forms, they think, well, if I'm going to be dead in the same sense, maybe my pet dog or cat is dead. Well, why not? And they never stop to think. I live in a state where we do a lot of hunting, and again, anyone who's gone through a experience of hunting knows that once an animal has died, those organs very quickly begin to break down and disintegrate. So, in point of fact, organs, unlike tissues, cannot be successfully removed from someone unless that person still has some circulation and has some oxygenation going to those organs. Tissues are different, and I need to make that distinction for you. So an organ is something like the heart, the lung, the liver, the kidneys. Those things, in the absence of oxygen and nutrition coming through the circulation, very quickly become unsuitable for transplant. But things like skin, bone, corneas, heart valves are much more resilient, and these things can, in fact, be removed from a biologically dead body and used for someone else.
Interesting. And, I actually meant to mention this before, and you said in the literature the name TK, which I did. That's almost near the end of where I got to in the book. Is the spine now doing more, or is it always doing plenty and the brain is not as necessary for certain things as we thought? Is that a possibility? I'm not sure, of course. I'm just asking.
Yeah, sure. Let me explain it to you. This is sort of interesting. Back in 1968, the original Harvard committee, when they made the Harvard criteria for brain death, I mean, they understood that the brain and the spinal cord are completely connected. They're not two separate structures. In fact, when you look up what is the central nervous system, it is the brain and spinal cord. There's no way to separate them. Right. So in the original Harvard criteria, not only did they need to show that the brain wasn't working, but they also demanded there be no spinal reflexes and no type of movement whatsoever. Whereas now that has been changed, which it defies logic. Now the American Academy of Neurology brain death guideline only tests for coma, the complete unresponsiveness to any type of stimulus. It tests for a handful, I think maybe 5 in adults, 6 in children, of brain stem reflexes. Now, your brain stem does a lot of important things to protect the head, but it has nothing to do with life or death. Mm-hmm. And they test what's called the apnea test. And the apnea test is a test where they remove you from your ventilator for 10, 15 minutes to see if you will breathe. Again, none of these things have ever been verified medically to show that they're something that proves life or death, but it's the consensus that people go with, and so it's a consensus document. So what Dr. Schumann has said is that honestly, someone like TK, whose brain was destroyed, yes, his spinal cord, after that initial shock of the system of going through a lot of difficulty as the body kind of rewired itself, obviously his spinal cord did take over and was able to manage, his blood pressure and all those things that need to be managed, his temperature, regulating all the other systems as best it could, and he lived 20 years like that.
That's incredible. Mm-hmm. Yes, I guess that's what I was thinking. So that's really wow. And I'm going to leave a link to the PDF of this Harvard document, so I'm sure everyone's curious at this point. The UDDA, Uniform Determination of Death Act, and I'll make sure that whoever wants to see it can. And of course, I'll leave a link to your website on the show notes as well. So please do visit. And since it's already come up a few times, I've been wanting to discuss it, and I don't want to keep bringing it up, but since COVID, people have been more aware of ventilators and what they do and how they affect people, and keeping people alive and stuff. It's been coming up. It's all over the book. Ventilators, potentially masking death or something along those lines. Can you give us a little more? I feel like people still don't really know exactly why they're used so often and why they come up so often, what's being discussed in this exact topic. I recall the UDDA mentioning 10 minutes of room air or something after the ventilator's off. I don't know if that's correct. I don't remember.
Okay.
But yeah, please go ahead.
So the things that happened in the 20th century that sort of led up to this idea of brain death. I mean, the first was the invention of the modern ICU with the ventilator, and suddenly people were being kept alive who always previously would have died, and this led to this concern that boy, we're going to have just massive ranks of hospitals filled with these people on ventilators, and they're at the time they thought these people were hopeless. Now, obviously, nearly 60 years having gone by, many of them now are routinely able to be helped, but back then they thought they would all be hopeless, and so they were kind of concerned that maybe if we put you on a ventilator, maybe you're already dead, but the fact that the ventilator is puffing air into you makes you look alive, which is it's a leap of logic. It's a gross oversimplification of the facts, right? So what all a ventilator does is it pushes oxygenated air into the lungs, okay? That's all it can do. Now, your own body has to be able to absorb that oxygen across the lung membrane. It has to be able to put it into the bloodstream. Your own body has to circulate the blood and take that oxygenation to the tissues. And it's a gross oversimplification. When I talk to doctors and medical students, I ask them, if you took your gross anatomy cadaver and intubated it and hooked it up to a ventilator, would it look alive? And everybody laughs because it's obviously ridiculous. Of course it wouldn't.
Sure.
Some people on a ventilator look alive because they are alive. Basically, that's the bottom line.
Right. If they weren't alive, they wouldn't look alive. Right. It's a matter of the spirit again, really.
That's right.
And inspiration being the breath. It's funny how that sort of goes hand in hand with that idea. It's very interesting. I'm trying to get the most out of this for myself too, because I am in the dark more than I'd like to be about certain topics. I'm trying to, get to speed, obviously. But my wife, being an ex-nurse, does have very good, idea about more of this stuff. Mm-hmm. And I hope to get you two connected, because she does like the life thing. She has questions for you. She's like, I'm telling you, she's fired up about the information that you've been presenting here. It's really cool.
Oh, I'd love to do that.
Yeah, to get this, out.
Yeah.
Something happened, right? I just happened to find you on X. I don't really use it too much, but I use it to see, like what's going on, what's modern thinking like today, mm-hmm. and as it keeps changing overnight, apparently. And I'm really glad I found you there.
Oh yeah.
But then maybe the next day, there was this registry that was down online, and people were trying to get themselves off of organ donor, being automatically added to organ donor lists. How much do you know about that? Can we talk about that for a second? It seemed to just suddenly come up the next day.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is that this is not just a U.S. issue. This mm-hmm. is all around the world. So, in the U.S. right now, we I have to say we sort of have a voluntary system for organ donation, and we sort of don't. So let me talk about the U.S. and then I'll talk about the other countries. So in the U.S. right now, we have a system where when you go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, they ask you, would you like to be an organ donor, again, without any type of informed consent. Most states, if you say, yes, I would like to be an organ donor, they mark that on your driver's license or put a sticker on your driver's license. Very few states actually have a no option. I'm very fortunate to live in Wisconsin, where our driver's license actually have a clear yes or no, I am not an organ donor option, which really is the best situation, to be able to not only say yes, but also to be able to refuse.
Right.
But the reason that's important is that the Uniform Anatomical Gift Act is another law we have. And what that act says is if you come into the hospital and you're incapacitated, right? You can't communicate your wishes. And your surviving family, your next of kin cannot be found to tell the hospital what you may or may not want done with your body. It turns out there's a chain of command. And if you and your family can't be found, there at the bottom of that list waiting are the pathologist and the hospital administrator. And so they can make you an organ and tissue donor if your wishes are not known. So in a way, you're already signed up unless you have a specific refusal documented. And so what I tell people is I would refuse because of this. The system right now is so unethical in the US. I would refuse to be a registered organ donor, and I would get off the National Organ Donor Registry. But you have to do more than that. You have to document a specific refusal. So if you live in a state where you cannot say no on your driver's license, then what I would do is I would have it put in your electronic medical record that you refuse to be an organ donor. I would carry a wallet card, and on our website we have a link where you can get a wallet card like that says I refuse to be an organ donor. And I would put it in your end of life documents, your healthcare power of attorney documents, and tell the people around you that you love that you don't want to be an organ donor and this is why. Now, in other countries in Europe, what they've gone to is making everybody in the country an organ donor unless you opt out, which is very concerning to me. I mean, it's sort of like you've now belong body and soul to your government. But there are a number of European countries, Ireland is the most recent one, where everyone now has been enrolled to be an organ donor unless you go to the website and opt out. So people are working very hard and very quickly to do that.
Sure. And is that the same thing for us that I just saw recently, maybe 2 weeks ago? The National Organ Donor Registry, is that the website that people are going to get themselves off?
Yeah, so that was sort of an interesting experience that I had. So people were always asking me, how do I get off the donor list? So I thought, well, I'll just do it myself, and so that I can tell people how it works. So I went on the National Organ Donor Registry list, and I, to get plugged in, you have to fill in your name and all your information, and then you hit send, right? And then right away, I got an immediate automatic response. Thank you, Heidi Klessig, for becoming an organ donor. I'm like, oh, that's not great. So then you have to go to the next page to say, the reason I'm here is I want to remove my name, but you have to put your name in to remove your name. Interestingly, I didn't get any confirmation from that second page that my name was removed. So then I had to email the registry, and they said, you need to give me more information. I had to give my gender and the state where I might have registered and, my birthday and all this stuff. And then a few days later, they did send me back confirmation that I had unsubscribed. I mean, I felt like, the Hotel California, that old Eagles song, right? You can check out anytime you want, but you can never leave, right? So I think that may have started sort of a flurry of people checking, and hopefully they're going to change that so that you don't have to subscribe to unsubscribe. But that's where it was when I went online.
Very, very interesting. And absolutely not even remotely surprising, unfortunately, because that's really, wow, wow. I wanted to also ask a question that you may have better perspective on than some other people as we kind of get to the end of the part one here. That I was curious that our corporeal selves, the corporation that we are born into because of our birth laws and stuff, which people are, quickly finding out is pretty nefarious stuff overall. If indeed you are transferring something from one corporation to another with an organ, is it considered that way? Is it like a corporation transferring wealth, goods, etc.? Is there paperwork that's very unique to this? Is there a lawyer that needs to be involved? Does it just get an approval and that's the end of it? I was very curious about that.
Okay, well, organ donation, there are many different ways to do it. And I'm not here saying that they're all unethical. So I do want to say that living donation, in which both the donor and the recipient remain alive after the procedure, completely ethical. So, I have a friend who gave a daughter of hers a kidney.
Right.
And so these transplants, the living donations, are really some of the most successful, because they took my friend and they took my friend's daughter. They had them in 2 operating rooms at the same time. The kidney was removed from the mother and hand carried, my friend says, like a baby. They carried it like a baby over to her daughter. And her daughter has now lived over 20 years with that new kidney, and it's going very well. So I'm not here to tell you that all organ transplantation is wrong. So that sort of thing, is very normal, natural, and healthy, as long as no one is coerced. And that is the thing. People have gone into sort of a black market way of finding someone who is, needing the money to come and pretend to be, your best friend, your distant cousin, and then under the table, these people are being paid for organs. And so you have to be careful of that sort of thing. In the question that you were asking, say you're declared brain dead, they actually, once the doctor makes that determination on your chart, your medical record for you is closed, and they actually open a new medical record with, I think they give you a number. I don't think you get a name, and now you're a commodity,
Sure.
right? You're not a person, you're a commodity, and they take that commodity to the operating room and remove that commodity's organs. The only country in the world where you can, you can compensate someone for that is, interestingly, it's Iran. In Iran, the organ donors' families, get compensated, but everywhere else, it's supposed to be a voluntary donation. But of course, the hospitals, and the organ procurement organizations, they do charge, processing fees, surgical fees. So the billed charges are really quite astronomical. The Milliman Actuarial Company, just here in 2025, came out with their statement of what, the billed charges are for, transplant. And it's somewhere, if you add it all up, it's around a $60 billion a year industry in the United States alone.
Well, there's, again, not even remotely surprising, very unfortunate that such a thing could, and I can see that being a potential, help in pushing people to want to do it and have the zeal, as you mentioned in some part of your book, where, in quotes, his zeal for helping others in need of organs, in his zeal, he had lost sight of somebody else's value as a person.
Oh, yeah, that was a story from my training too. I was up in the pediatric ICU. I was getting another patient ready for an operation, and just the nurse sitting next to me at the desk, she goes, under her breath, she goes, "Vultures." And I look up, and it's the transplant team. We're making rounds, and they were visiting one of their patients that was in the pediatric ICU. And then when they were done, they started shopping. I can't think of any other word for it. They started looking around at all the other little boys and girls to see if, how are they doing? Are any of them potential donors? And the chief transplant surgeon came up to the desk, and he smiled at us, and he said, how is so-and-so doing? Not very well, with this tone in his voice. And so the nurses had a bad feeling about this. They were calling them vultures, which certainly was what they were doing.
Wow. Yeah, well, I completely agree, unfortunately. I wanted to mention the concept of zombies earlier, because it seems as if, there was a lot of mistaken resurrections, as people were just buried alive or claimed dead when they weren't. And they were seen as, possessed by the devil or something. It's funny how this all comes full circle when we look at this in a whole new light, the way we are right now. And I also find the year 1968 to be very interesting in a certain way, because the tail end of the 60s really provided our United States culture with a lot of new things to think about as we made our way into the 70s. We landed on the moon, for example, right? Doing so really can, well, look, I'm not going to my audience knows how I feel about all that. But the idea of if we had left our realm to travel to the moon, that can spark a new wave of atheism as well. And I think the timing is really pertinent to introduce this topic as, and you also mentioned there was a lot of, eventually, maybe by the 80s, a lot of talk of euthanasia, a lot of talk of abortions. It all just seems to go hand in hand.
Yeah, it is interesting. 1968, it was an interesting time in history. People were very excited about all the new scientific developments. And so there was this idea of sort of scientism and progress that sort of bowled a lot of this through our public consciousness. Dr. Christian Barnard had just done his second heart transplant on January 1st, 1968, I think is when that patient, came into the hospital with a brain bleed. And interestingly, at that time, they weren't really sure that this all was legal. And then they sort of strong-armed that Dr. Hoffman, who was caring for the young man with a brain injury, into declaring him dead, even though his heart was still beating, because they wanted a good outcome.
They needed a beating heart, right? Yeah.
That's right. Dr. Barnard was like a media star. I mean, if you look, even though the man was married, he was dating starlets like Gina Lollobrigida, and he was making all the talk shows. I mean, there was quite a hoopla about him. I mean, in a way, 1968 was sort of the last year where people had this sort of unquestioning devotion to whatever a doctor said, which changed. I mean, in 1971, the abortion issue became a huge public outcry, but 1968 and the brain death idea kind of slipped through before that public consciousness was arisen.
It's how they do their thing, whoever they may be. Sometimes the type of, let's just call it advertising, for put a simple word on it, the kind of advertising needed to push an agenda comes in different kinds of waves, and sometimes it comes from different angles. And that's why I keep discussing the atheism thing. It just seems so much easier to do something like this if you are claiming to be an atheist. But there's clearly something else beyond that trifecta of the neurological, cardiovascular, pulmonary. There seems to be the soul, at the very least, some kind of other spirit. And I am actually a biofield tuner practitioner, and I use these tuning forks to scan the biofield for people that are out of tune, so to speak. I'm not physically touching them whatsoever. And yet my most recent client, for example, I detected, based on her age, that somewhere around 30 or 32-ish, 35 years old, she felt like there was a lack of communication, something. And she said her mom was unable to speak anymore, and she suddenly couldn't even speak to her anymore. I found this in the biofield. I didn't even know this, right? Then I found out that something was wrong with her birth, and that the father had to go through some trauma at that time. And she said, yeah, I was born totally blue. And, what that non-medical term for that. And then her father had to, quit smoking and a few other things. And that put a lot of stress on him to help her. And I found this in the biofield. There is something there. It is definitely not just your physical. It keeps getting proven time and again. And maybe it isn't detectable, but I can comb it and I can feel it. Even, I used to always know, for example, I would be walking up to my classroom. I would always know if there was a TV on in there. I could feel it. And there's other factors that are very hard to describe, but clearly there.
Well, we know this as doctors, the placebo effect. If people are given a placebo, 30% of the time it works just like a drug would work. Uh-huh. There's a mind-body interaction going on. Absolutely there is. And we don't know enough about it. And we need to study it more.
Mm. And as an anesthesiologist, I assume that you had access to drugs that people would never normally have any access to or even knowledge of.
Oh, sure. That's what we use all the time. That's how we put you to sleep.
Yeah, it's a mysterious thing, because I went under once too, and it's just, that's it. He's like, count down from 100. I got to 98. And then the guy, he was a funny guy for sure. I want to, if you don't mind, let's take a small break here. Let's kind of put part one to end, and we'll have a little extra information for my subscribers in part two here. But I do want to end with this, because it seems like, doctors saying that this is morally defensible and things of that nature. There are humongous trust issues lately between people and the medical industry. And it seems as if doctors are clearly being trained to believe that brain death is actual death. Is this the biggest problem? Like a diploma equals infallibility? Ideology of the elites become law?
I'll read you a quote, because there's a lot of pressure for people to keep their mouths shut. So Harvard, one of the people who wrote What is the Meaning of Death in 1981 was Harvard professor of philosophy Daniel Wickler. And he wrote a long chapter telling people, how come brain dead people are dead. But then years later, he told reporter Rachel Aviv from the New Yorker, he admitted he had actually deceived his fellow committee members. Here's what he said. I was put in a tight spot and I fudged. I knew that there was an air of bad faith about it. I made it seem like there are a lot of profound unknowns and went in the direction of fuzziness so that no one could say, hey, your philosopher says this is nonsense. That's what I thought, but you'd never know from what I wrote. So there is stonewalling going on. There is deception and lying going on because there's this huge social pressure to keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, that's a definite. And when I was still, I grew up, my first 40 years were in New York. And I had my first child in 2020, around that time that I don't want to have to use that word again, but that was the time that everyone remembers, that unfortunate time. And the doctor was ready to give her a vaccine. And I said, what's in this? And she says, I can't tell you, but I give it to my kids. I'm like, that's not good enough. And I said, I respect that you put so much time to become who you are here. But there's clearly questions you have not answered for yourself yet. And how can I possibly trust any further after everything that's just happened recently? What she's like, I have to deny you care. I'm like, I gotta go, gotta leave. And we ended up finding someone who was not going to be pushing vaccines on us, thankfully, before we left New York. And this is what part 2 is for, to be able to speak a little more freely about things like that. I do have some other interesting questions for you that I think you will find interesting to answer. And I really hope that everyone got so much out of this conversation. We've already talked about so many things that I find personally to be beyond important, especially now. And if you want to just give everyone a quick, where to find your website, your book, before we go here.
Sure. I'm Dr. Heidi Klessig. My website is respectforhumanlife.com. Be sure to put the human in there or you won't find me. Respectforhumanlife.com. You can read my book. It's on Amazon. It's called The Brain Death Fallacy. And if you want to follow me on X, it's at Heidi Klessig, MD.
Okay, thank you so much for your time and the time that you're about to give for our part 2. And we'll see my subscribers at part 2 and everyone else. If this interests you, please go find out everything you can about Dr. Heidi Klessig. She's doing amazing work. And the book is, it's actually a quick read if you don't stop yourself every 5 seconds to find out all this new information. So please do get it. You will definitely appreciate the time spent reading it. Thank you again for being here.